But not to worry, because even though the next episode might come at a later time than the usual uploads, beautiful, isn't it? Well, I believe it would be fair to say that for the past couple of months I have been cooking, so please allow me to introduce you to my restless days and sleepless nights worth of work and research. It might not look like much, but getting all of these parts ready for installation and in the state that they are currently in took a great amount of work and time and was a pretty involving process, however, one that would be very boring to watch and one that you would have hardly anything to learn from. So I chose not to take you through it, but instead to show you the finished products. So if you are still not impressed, beware, because I still have 3 boxes full of bolts and gaskets which we will get through while rebuilding it. So let's get to work. One trick for the engine stand bolts where you don't have a hole to thread into is to just use a simple nut from behind. Now that we are back in the lab, I want to show you how nice the engine block that I managed to pick up is. The cylinder bores are spotless, having not one single scratch or nick, which, as we know, for the aluminum engine blocks is a total deal breaker. And it's the same exact thing on the other side as well. After I got the engine block and I checked to make sure that it has no hidden damage that we were unaware of, I started prepping the head surfaces for both the first and the second bank, and then I cleaned all of the oil and coolant passages with a bunch of brake cleaner and compressed air to make sure that they are dry and free of any dirt or contaminants. I then lubed up all of the cylinder bores with oil to make sure that they do not rust or that any dirt gets trapped inside, and now it is ready to accept its new crankshaft. Now, after months of scavenging parts and relentless cleaning, let's finally flip this baby around and start the fun part. But before we proceed, there is still one thing that we need to address. Now we are talking. So, the first order of business are the oil nozzles. These keep the pistons cool by spraying oil onto their backside. I have already cleaned them with brake cleaner and I have checked that the valve inside is free and moving easily, as it should. And now we're going to reinstall all of them. This can only go in one way and there is no real thing to look out for other than to make sure that they are fully seated before you torque them down. And now torque time. Now let's take out the main caps. Let's pop out the old bearings. A clean rag to clean up the surface. Don't forget that the third cap also has a thrust bearing, which you have to clean the groove for. Don't forget to also clean out the old caps. The main bearings I have decided to go with are a set of King's bearings. Here are the part numbers, should you need them. These are a very popular option among the N63 rebuilders, as they are a very good alternative to the original BMW bearings, given their soft material composition. When reinstalling the main caps, pay attention to these so-called threaded support sleeves, which are basically nothing more than a screw that threads into your main cap, because these need to be unwinded when you are installing the caps, and then when the time comes, we will have to tighten them until they reach the engine block, and that is going to be a torque of approximately 6 Newton meters. But we will get to that later, so for now, just make sure that they are completely threaded in. Alright, now let's install some bearings. Key things to look out for are the fact that in the box you're going to find two different ones. One with holes for the oil to pass through and one without holes. The one without holes goes onto the cap and the one with holes goes onto the engine block. It is pretty hard to mix them up, however, because as you can see, they both have notches that would not line up anywhere else. Now find the cleanest clean rag that you can find, which for me is a new one. Clean the bearing seating surface, align the notch, and then push it all the way through until it is fully seated and it is not protruding on either side. And now rinse and repeat for all of the others. And now we'll do the same exact thing for the caps. Line up the notch and then push it all the way in. Just like that. Now I have once again cleaned all of the bearings that we installed in the engine block, as well as the ones that we installed in the caps. First off, I'm going to install the crankshaft dry so that we can apply some plastic gauge and read out all of the clearances so that we can make sure that we are well within spec and that everything that we are going to be doing from here on is going to have a solid foundation. Phew. One thing to note here is that before installing the crankshaft, I have once again cleaned all of the oil passages with compressed air and brake cleaner, and I have also cleaned out all of the journals. As you may already know, clearances are the key to having a long-lasting engine. So, with this being said, we are going to measure the clearance for our main bearings using plastic gauge. Plastic gauge is not the most accurate way of measuring clearance, but it is going to give us a good hint of whether we are on the right track or not. The way it works is that you apply a thin layer of this plastic thingy that they supply you with onto your journal, you tighten the caps, and then when you undo them, you come up with this file that they give you for reference, and you check to see how tight it has been squished so that you get a rough estimate of the clearance that is left when everything is tight and done. And we want to do this for all of the journals because while the clearance may be right on some of them, others might not. That's it, and now it's time for the caps. For this procedure, I'm going to be using some of the old bolts because they are torque to yield and it does not really matter that they are not going to be the most accurate, but they're going to give us a rough estimate. Pay attention to how you are installing the caps because it is of the utmost importance that you install them exactly where they came from and in the same orientation. So for this one, it is number 3. The numbering starts from the front of the engine, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and the orientation is like this. The number has to be facing bank 2 with cylinders 5 to 8. Gently place it in, and now use the bolts to drive it all the way through, gently and evenly. You could use power tools to speed up the whole process, but I would rather go by hand to make sure that everything goes in exactly as it's supposed to. And now that all of them are fully seated, it's time to torque them in the specific sequence. That was the first stage, and now on to the second. And now let's undo them and check the results. Well, all I have to say right now is that the suspense is killing me, for sure. Let's find out how well we did. So now first off, let's get to measuring and then we'll talk about the results afterwards. First off, the fifth cap. You can see that the clearance is a bit tighter than 0.50, but for sure not as tight as 0.038. The next one, again, a bit tighter than 50, but not as tight as 38. Cap number 3, a bit tighter than 50, but not as tight as 38. The second one, for sure tighter than 50, but not as tight as 38. Now for the last one, which you can see that is almost right on the 50. Alright, so now that we are done measuring, let's finally take a look at what these results actually mean. The OEM specification for how tight the clearance between the main bearing and the crankshaft should be is anywhere between 0.020 to 0.046 mm. Usually, it is best to place yourself in the upper half of this range, as the tighter the clearance, the tighter it is also going to get once everything is hot and up to operating temperature, and that could lead to a disaster real quick. Now, for our own measurements, for the first cap, we placed ourselves right at the upper limit with 0.050 millimeters. For the second one, we recorded a 0.038 to 0.050 millimeter range, and for the next ones, well, they all followed suit. So, as I've said in the beginning, plastic gauge is not the most accurate, and it is only going to give us a rough estimate, and even if the clearance on the first cap would actually be 0.050 millimeters, there is absolutely no reason to worry, because first off, we have a brand new oil pump, and secondly, we are also going to run on a bit thicker oil than what the factory specification is, with a 5W40 for better lubrication and protection of the engine. So, with this in mind, there is absolutely no reason to be worried, and we can proceed. For cleaning the crankshaft and the bearings of the plastic gauge, I used a clean rag and brake cleaner once again. Now that we are done with the measurements and we know that everything is alright, I'm going to remove the crankshaft, lube all of the bearings with assembly lube, and then place it back and tighten it all down for one last time. Carefully lift it up. Final wipe down of the bearings. And now with some clean gloves, assembly lube for all of the bearings. I am also going to lube up the thrust bearings, both of them, that is. And now the final installation. Whew. Nice. And with that, the torquing of the main bolts is now done. Let's see how easily the crankshaft turns now. Butter smooth. Spectacular. Being able to turn it with your own hand is the best feeling in the world. Beautiful. Up next are these bolts, which go into these slots, and as per the BMW repair manual, they should also be replaced, as these will also get torqued to a specific angle of rotation. These also get torqued in the specific sequence and in 2 stages, as well as the main bolts. Next up are the threaded support sleeves. What I have now done is that I have threaded them in until they have started touching the block, and now they're ready to be torqued. The manual doesn't show an exact sequence of torquing these, so I'm going to go with the same exact sequence in which we did the rest of the bolts. I couldn't tighten almost any one of these any more than I already did, so if you manage to get them snug to where they touch the block, that seems like it's plenty. Up next, there are these 3 types of different bolts that we are going to be installing into the angled screwed connections, and I'm going to show you exactly where each one of them goes. There are 7 of these inverted Torx bolts, which we are going to be installing from the front of the engine to the back, and the last one of these inverted Torx bolts goes towards cylinders 5 to 8, so on the bank too. These last 3 bolts are all part of the oil pump assembly and will help secure it in place. The 2 threaded ones will go on the side with the first bank with cylinders 1 to 4, and the last one will go on the bank 2 with cylinders 5 to 8. Make sure you install them in the correct orientation with the hex bolt facing upwards. Once again, there is no specific torque sequence, so I'm going to go with the same pattern that we did for the last bolts. And with that being said, the crankshaft is now completely torqued and it is still moving effortlessly. Now it is finally time to flip this thing around and start working from the top side. Before we start installing the pistons, we need to turn our attention towards the piston rings. These will sit onto the piston and will help create a tight seal for both compression not to leak out with these 2 compression rings, and for the oil to get dragged back down into the oil sump with this oil control ring. For them to be able to do this, their end clearance, or more popular known as the gap, needs to be into the specifications of what each manufacturer states. We'll start off by measuring the end clearance for the first piston ring. For this, we need a clean piston ring, a lot of oil for both the bore and the piston, and a filler gauge. Now install the piston ring into the bore. And now gently push it evenly inside of the bore with a piston. The specification for the first compression ring is between 0.15 to 0.30 millimeters. And as this cylinder block is neither new nor refurbished, I expect us to land somewhere at the upper half. So let's see. This is the 30 millimeter. Which I have barely managed to put in, and it's not even moving. So I think we are right on the limit. But just to make sure, I will also check with the 0.35. Yes, so the next higher number does not fit, try as I might. So it's safe to say that this is a 0.3 millimeter gap. Now to carefully re-extract the ring, pull it upwards from all of the sides evenly. Until it finally comes out. And that's the first measurement done. Now the second compression ring, plenty oil, and carefully install it in the same way as we did with the first compression ring. Push it down with the piston. For the second compression ring, the end clearance should be between 0.30 mm to 0.50 mm. So to measure it, here I have a 50 and a 55 composed of a 25 and a 30. We'll start off with the 50, which I can just barely fit in, and it's harder to pull out, and the 55, which I cannot fit in. So that is right on the upper limit, but this is still fine, however, because even though it is on the upper limit, we are still within the specified clearances. Now we will take it out in the same way that we took out the first compression ring, slowly from all sides, and there it is. And for the next piston rings that I'm going to be measuring off camera, they are all going to be measured in the respective bore. Alright, so after going through all of the measurements and spending way more time doing so than I'd like to admit, the results are finally in. And as you can see, we are right on the upper limit, but since this is still within the specified clearance range, I believe everything is going to be just fine. So with this being said, out with the papers and measurements, and let's start reassembling. For the next step, here is everything that we are going to need, starting from all of the 8 pistons with their respective connecting rods, which have thoroughly been cleaned on the exterior, on the interior, and also, very important as well, on the piston ring grooves. Up next, the piston rings, which we have just finished measuring, the connecting rod bearings for both the lower and the upper cap, the assembly loop, and most important, which we must not forget about, the plastic gauge, which we are going to need for measuring the clearances between the connecting rods bearings and the crankshaft once again. I also want to quickly mention that even though these are the same exact pistons and connecting rods that have come out of the same exact engine block, I have also taken an extra step in measuring each one of them individually, just to make sure that their weight is roughly the same within a couple of grams of each other, which is an acceptable difference, and that once everything is up and running, there are going to be no vibrations or weird imbalances. Also, the way to install the pistons can only be seen once the piston is clean. As you can see, here is a QR code, and next to it is an arrow, which is pointing left of the QR code. That arrow needs to be pointing towards the front of the engine. Now, for the installation of the piston rings, I'm going to start with the middle ring, which is the second compression ring, which also acts a bit as an oil scraper ring, because it has some grooves on the bottom, but you can also tell which one is the top side by the marking on the front. There it is, now it is in. And of course, if you're going to use piston ring pliers, it's going to be even easier. Now the first compression ring. For this one, you also need to pay attention to the top side, but there is nothing on it that you can tell which one is the top side other than the writing. Now all that is left to put in is the oil control ring. The oil control ring is made out of 2 individual pieces, the expander, which expands, and the ring itself. To install it, we first install the expander and then we install the ring onto the expander. So this expander is going to sit inside of the ring itself. So first the expander, now we tighten it down. Now the oil ring. And now that's also in. To make sure that everything is working as it should, you can spin them by hand and make sure that they are seated all the way through and there's no funny business going on. When looking from the top of the piston rings should be placed 120 degrees one from each other, which would be like a Mercedes-Benz sign, but you also need to make sure that they are not in line with the gudgeon pin, as that would lead to all sorts of issues. So there's the first compression ring. Next one is going to be somewhere around here. Now the oil control ring, which we're going to place over here. So we have now created a Mercedes-Benz sign. First, the second, and the third. Alright, and now it is time for the installation. I have already installed the first piston just to get a feel of things and to make sure that everything goes smoothly and that I can walk you through step by step exactly as I do it. First off, take the piston, remove the cap, and clean the bearing seating surface. Now install the bearing into its grooves. Making sure that it is seated all the way in, just like so. Now, since we have already dealt with the connecting rod bearing, let's also place it inside of the cap. Exactly like for the connecting rod, place the bearing inside of the grooves, just like so. Make sure that you are wearing the cleanest pair of gloves that you can. Clean out the bore, and now fresh oil. Now get some oil onto both the skirts and the piston rings. The oil on the piston is just to make sure that it moves freely and it will just slide right into the cylinder bore. This is the piston press tool that I'm going to be using. First up, unwind it all the way so that the piston can go in easily. Up next, place it over the piston and the piston rings and start slowly tightening it down. And also, before placing the piston right back in its cylinder bore, make sure that a little bit of the skirt is visible on both sides so that you can align it perfectly with the bore. And now, with a final check to make sure that the orientation of the piston is correct with the arrow facing towards the front of the engine, gently place it down inside of the bore. Get the skirts in. Perfect. And now here comes the fun part. I'm going to use the handle of a hammer to tap down the piston compressor to make sure that it is fully seated. And now I'm going to slowly press in the piston. And just like that, it's in. Now let's turn this party around. And now with some help from the backside, I'm going to push the piston all the way in until the rod makes its way onto the crankshaft. There. Measure the clearances for the rod bearings. We're firstly going to clean up the crank. Place a string of plastic gauge onto each journal. And now gently place the caps back. I have cleaned the old bolts and I have oiled them up for a better measurement on the torque setting. And now the second one. And now to torque them. These bolts get torqued in 4 different stages. And now 75 degrees of rotation. Now let's undo them and check the results. Now let's take a look at the results that we have got. The clearance for the con rods for the N63 are between 0.028 to 0.070. If we take a look at the first journal, we can see that it is perfectly on the 0.50, which is right on spec. And if we take a look at the next one, you can see that it is a bit tighter than 50, but not as tight as 0.038. So it is somewhere in between those two. But still, these numbers are well within specifications and I have no issues regarding them because, as I've said, we are gonna install a brand new oil pump and also a bit thicker oil than what the factory recommends for the higher efficiency. So now I'm going to get to installing all of the rest of the pistons, measuring all of the clearances. And now for the final time, let's push the rods off the crankshaft, lube them with assembly lube, and tighten everything down for the last time. Right, now slowly push the rod back in its place. And that's it. Now do the same for the other one. I'll put the excess onto the crankshaft because I can't do it any better. Now pull it back up. That's it. Both are now fully seated. Lube up the bearings from the cap. As per the repair manual, the bolts should be lightly oiled as well. Extremely easy to turn. So satisfying. And now we just need to do it 6 more times. And with that right there, the bottom end is completely done. And now let's see it in action. Everything is turning beautifully, exactly as it should. You don't believe me? Come take a look at the piston dents. Magnificent. Since we have been talking so much about oil pressure, let's now see how we are going to supply them. Firstly, we have a brand new BMW oil pump, because this is definitely a place that you do not want to cheap out on. We have a brand new oil pump chain, because this stretch like there is no tomorrow. We have all new gaskets for both of the pipes, which feed oil into the oil pump and then onto all of the oil galleries from inside the engine block. And unfortunately, we have the old gear and buffer plate, because conveniently BMW does not supply these with the new oil pump like they do on other models. Take the N47 for example. But since there is so little stress and tension on these gears, you can see that the teeth look basically brand new, and with a new oil pump chain I have no worries that this is going to work out perfectly fine. First off, we'll install the oil pump baffle plate, which can only go in a certain way. Align the holes, and now torque them. Why do they always choose the biggest package for the tiniest seal? Now let's install the new seals onto the feed pipes, new and soft. Slides right on. Now the other one. Slides right into this groove, and the black one that sits right here, we're going to install into the engine block right now. This is where the second gasket sits, the one that I was talking about. Needs to first off in the groove where it sits in. Look at all of that dirty oil that came out. We definitely do not want such dirt inside of our engine. That's good. So now that we have cleaned the groove where it sits, I'm also going to lube up the gasket a little bit for an easier installation. Now squeeze it in. Check to make sure that it is seated all the way, which it is. Now let's place the oil pipes. Finally, I was so afraid of hammering it in, but it needed a good bit of persuasion just to get it in, and now you can see that it is really in there. Hopefully the second one goes in a bit easier than that one. Night and day difference. The oil pump, line it up onto the threads. Now gently place it onto the gasket. There it is. To secure the oil pump, there are two nuts and the bolt. The nuts go on the threads and the bolt goes right in here, but we are not going to install it just yet because here is an adjuster for the oil pump chain tension. So first off the nuts. Now we'll install the chain onto the crankshaft, onto the gear, and line up the gear with the oil pump. Perfectly. Now the nut, which you need to be careful of because it is a left-handed thread. To tighten the pump, I will need something to hold on to, so I will install back two of the flywheel bolts. In comes the old rusty pipe. Now let's tighten the bolt. That's the first stage, and now we are supposed to place an additional 40 degrees of rotation onto the nut, but since this is a pretty generic number and it is pretty easy to eyeball, I'm going to draw the line on the nut and on the bolt where we are currently standing. And since 90 is over here, we just need to get in the middle of that. As you can see, exactly where we want it. 40 degrees. Seems like we've managed to eyeball it pretty good. Now, as you can see, the chain is pretty loose and we're gonna have to adjust this to fit into the specified range. But before we do this, I would first like to put the engine rear main seal on because that will give us a flat surface that we can measure the stretch of the chain on. First, allow me to clean the surface as good as I can. Here is the rear main seal. It comes as a whole package, not just the seal, because why would you only replace the seal, right? We also have to waste a little bit of aluminum. Also, as you can see, along this aluminum piece, there is a gasket that BMW doesn't sell individually, so that's why you also have to buy the whole kit. It also comes with an installation lip, a bush, as they call it, which if the seal is stored without for more than 6 months, they say that the seal is no good. According to the specifications of the repair manual, the crankshaft should be lightly coated in a thin layer of oil, so we're going to do just that. Now let's install it. We have to place the bush onto the crankshaft and then push it all the way in, while also making sure to align it with the tabs in the engine block. Just like that. Perfect. Clean bolts. And now torque them down from inside to outwards. Now that we have a flat surface to rely on, we can check to see how loose the chain is and how much we need to tighten it. You can see that it has well over 20 millimeters of play, and the specification says that it should have somewhere between 10 to 12 millimeters of play. To tighten the chain, inside of the oil pump right here is an 8 millimeter Allen that we need to tighten until it gets as tight as we need it to be. There. It is now at 11.69, which is, I think, perfect. You can see as well that it is pretty tight in there. So now we can finally insert the oil pump screw and now torque it down as well. Down here there is another coolant cover that I would like to change for a new one. Now, normally when you undo this cover, there should be some coolant leaking, but since our engine has been open for this much time and that I have cleaned it so much, I believe there's nothing that's gonna come out of this. Holy smokes. This thing has never ever been off. And it had such a good feel. Well, at least it's good that we are cleaning because there is a lot of junk in here that would have otherwise messed with all our cooling system. Now clean up the surface, wipe it all off with some brake cleaner. Now once again replace the whole thing because why would you only be able to buy a seal, right? Here it is, and there it goes. A bit cleaner hardware. And now torque it down. There is no specific torquing sequence, so I'm just gonna go from inside out diagonally. Mark them all, and that's a job well done as well. Before we get too far and get past the point of no return, I would like to install the knock sensors because generally they sit right over here under the intake manifold, and at a later time it would be extremely difficult to access them. There are two on each side, and I have cleaned them up as best as I could, and I also marked their orientation to know how to install them because first of all, if they are installed in the wrong orientation, the wiring harness is not going to be able to reach, and secondly, I'm not sure if it does matter or not, but their purpose is to be able to tell if the engine is knocking and most importantly where the knock is coming from. So if you install it upside down, for example, then I'm not sure how well it is going to be able to tell which side the knock is coming from. Some exhaust bracketry with tiny screws. I couldn't find any torque specification on these, so I'll just go with 10. Another one of these now much cleaner brackets. This one is actually for the transmission oil cooler lines. Good and twist. The next big thing to deal with is now the timing. As you can see, we have brand new almost everything, starting from the chains, the guides, rails, brand new tensioners, the crankshaft sprocket, and even this little guide rail that sits on the back of the timing cover. Brand new bolts for the camshaft sprockets because these are stretch bolts which need to be replaced, the Venus adjusters which have been thoroughly cleaned and are going to have brand new gaskets, and all new gaskets for all of the covers that we are going to be installing as well. We'll kick it off by removing the crankshaft sprocket. Here it is in comparison to the new one. You can see that the teeth are starting to slightly be a bit worn out, so definitely a good thing that we are also replacing it. As per the repair manual, in order for the new sprockets to easily fit into the crankshaft and to be fully seated, it would need to be heated until 60 degrees. Well, this is not quite 60, but it will surely do. And there it goes. For easier installation of the timing chains, I'm going to rotate the engine. The guide bolts, which hold the rails for the first bank. Normally you should not need to remove these, but since I got the engine with them already removed, what I'm going to do right now is apply a bit of thread locker onto both of them because BMW says they are micro-encapsulated, which is a fancy name for saying you need to use thread locker. Now the ones for the second bank. First chain that we are going to install is the one from the second bank over the crankshaft. And the guide also sits into the bolts that we have just installed. We'll let it sit like that. Next up, the other guide. Now repeat for the first bank as well. Chain onto the crankshaft, the guide onto the bolt. And now the second guide. Just like so. Make sure the chain is fully seated, both onto the crankshaft and onto the guide rails where it's possible. Here is the timing cover. We need to knock out the front seal. It's out now. Here's the jump guard. Here's how it sits. New gaskets, and God forbid you add sealant to this because they already have from the factory, as you can see. So there's absolutely no need. Here's how it looks, and now it is ready for installation. Now the trickiest part of all of it, installing the timing cover. New front main seal, take it off of the support bush, and gently place it inside of the timing cover. And now slowly tap it in. And there it is, the front main seal is now also fully seated in. For further setting the timing of the engine and for the front main seal to not sit without it being supported, we are now going to install the vibration damper, which we need to slide onto the notch. Now the bolt. Alright, that's gonna do the trick for now, because the torque we need for this bolt is insanely huge, and for the sole purpose of turning the engine and having the vibration damper in for the moment, it is just fine. Up next, since all of the work at the bottom end is completely done, we can now go ahead and seal it up with the oil pans. For this, we need to add a tiny drop of silicone where the front timing cover and the rear main seal cover meet the block. Just like so. There need not be too much silicone because the excess will anyways just be thrown outwards. And as I have also stated in the beginning, the gaskets all have a tiny bit of silicone, but the repair manual calls for a tiny bit more. It says that the drop that we apply should be around 4 millimeters, but if you smear a bit of silicone on there, it should be just fine. As you can see, on the upper oil sump gasket, there is also a bit of silicone added from factory, but there is still need for a little bit more. New upper oil pan gasket, carefully place it in, line up the holes, and since we have added a little bit of silicone, I'll also have it keep the gasket in place until I bring the oil pan. A very much cleaner upper oil pan, going right in, carefully, and try to line up the holes as best as you can. There are 27 bolts for the upper oil pan, and BMW states that they all should be renewed, but only because from factory they are all coated in a little bit of thread locker to not seep oil through the threads. So what I did is I cleaned all of the threads from the bolts and the threads inside of the block, applied my own thread locker, and now the bolts are ready to be reused. There are two different lengths of bolts that we are going to use for the upper oil pan, and they are pretty easy to remember which goes where, because the 5 ones that are longer go in the back. Up next, the oil pickup tube, which I have thoroughly, and I mean thoroughly cleaned a bunch of times, with a new gasket, of course. Not that it is even worth mentioning at this point. Torquey torque. Now, since this is a brand new oil pump, which from factory comes with very little lubrication, I'm going to pour in a little bit of oil and then turn the engine a couple of times so that it gets well lubricated and oil starts circulating through it well before we even attempt cranking. Just like so. I'm also going to pour a little bit on the chain, since this is also very little lubricated from factory. And now gently spin it. Now that we are sure that it is not going to spin dry, we can proceed with the installation of the lower oil pan. Prep the surface, make sure it is well degreased. This is a brand new gasket. Line it up perfectly. One clean lower oil pan. Line it up. For the lower oil pan, the manual doesn't state a specific torquing sequence, but rather just the value, so I'm going to go in a crisscross pattern from inside outwards. The oil level sensor, install the brand new gasket, make sure it is fully seated in, and now gently place it in. It only goes in one certain position. The nuts. While we are at it, let's also replace the copper washer for the drain plug. A much cleaner drain plug and the brand new copper washer. Since the bottom end is now completely done, it's time to move our focus back up top. I have gone ahead and placed the timing chain inside of the two guide rails so that when we place the head, everything is going to be as tight as possible so that we can maneuver it around the guides. I am also going to apply a bit of sealant where the front timing cover meets the head. You only want to smear a little bit of silicone, not too much, and this is as per BMW repair manual. That is plenty. Brand new head gasket, they are the same for the first and the second bank. Carefully, and now align it onto the dowels. Make sure it is seated all the way in, and have the silicone also hold it a bit in place. That's good. The head, which as you can see looks awesome. Now let's try to maneuver it around the guides. Perfect. Well, that was easier than expected. For the installation, here we have brand new bolts which come pre-coated, and the manual explicitly states that we should not remove the coating from them. Also, one important thing to note is that we should also install the shims that were installed beforehand. Now that all of the bolts have been run down, it's time to torque them, and as before, these are torqued wheel bolts that get stretched in multiple stages. Now there are two more of these M8 bolts that sit at the front of the cylinder head, and you do not, really do not want to drop these. Even though I've done an equally good job at clearing out the second cylinder head as well, you can definitely tell that these two valves have been changed. And that's because when the engine broke and the pistons broke and pieces started going everywhere, two of the valves got hit in the process, as you can see here. They should not be this bent, they should be straight, creating a tight seal with the cylinder head so that no pressure from the combustion chamber gets out when it's not supposed to. Moreover, had I not changed these valves, considering how bent they were, piston to valve contact would have been imminent and thus all of our work would have just gone to scrap. Now that the second cylinder head is fully sorted as well, we'll proceed with adding silicone to the timing cover. Snake the gasket around the guides, the clean cylinder head, and now finally, let's say goodbye to these shiny looking pistons, hopefully forever. Perfect. Since I have had to replace these two bent valves, I have also had to remove the intake cam and the cam caps, which we are now going to reinstall. To do this, firstly we need to add oil to the journals, reinstall all of the rocker arms, now we are going to install the intake camshaft, and as per the BMW repair manual, the cams from cylinder 5, meaning these two, should point to the side of the block, that way. I'll do another round of oil. The cam caps are marked and they are also numbered. As you can see, on this one it says RE1, meaning right intake cam cap number 1, which is the first one. They can only be installed in a certain position. It is also important to make sure that you tighten these in half turns, as the camshafts are not that strong and they can also break really easily. Torquey torque. Now for the timing chain guide that is moving, we are going to have to insert this screw plug through it. Now, if you remember, these are the same ones that broke this torx bit, and it is insane to think that they only get torqued to 10 Newton meters. After installing both of the cylinder heads, we now get to the fun part, which is actually pretty easy on this car. Timing the N63 is nothing but synchronizing the crankshaft to the camshafts, because there is no high pressure fuel pump that needs to be driven off of a chain, but instead it gets driven off of the exhaust camshaft. So, to time the engine, we have this tool which locks the crankshaft as so. It sits right in there. We have a screw to insert to hold it to the vibration damper. And we also have a tool to slide in right into the timing mark that sits like so. Doing this ensures us that the first piston is at 150 degrees past TDC. To set the timing of the camshafts, we have these tools which sit right onto the camshafts. like so. And they should be flush with the cylinder head on both sides. That was for the exhaust, and this one is for the intake. They are the same exact part number, and they can be switched between them. Now that the camshafts are partially locked, we are going to install the first camshaft adjuster, which is the exhaust one. You can see that here it says Auspuff for German exhaust. Pull all of the tension out of the chain, place it onto the chain, and now slide it onto the camshaft. Just like so. Now the one for intake. Pull all of the tension out of the chain once again. And there we go. The camshaft adjusters also require brand new bolts, and these should also be coated on the backside with some copper grease. First one going in. Now the second. The repair manual states that these should be tightened until they make contact with the adjusters and then released 90 degrees. Now we have to install the top guide, which sits right above the chain. Torque it down. Now we have this special tool made out of 3 pieces. This one threads into the cylinder head, this one on top of it, and this is what holds the camshaft locking tools from sliding out. So first, thread the piece into the cylinder head until it makes contact. It doesn't need to be crazy tight. Now the camshaft locking tool holder and the bolt that goes through them. Again, this does not need to be crazy tight, just tight to make sure that the camshaft locking tools do not move while we proceed with the next stage. Now we are going to need this mechanical chain tensioner, because were we to use a normal hydraulic one, when we tighten the chain, all of the slack is going to be pushed right into the chain tensioner and the timing is not going to be correctly set. As you can see, this is how it acts. When we tighten this bolt, this piece gets pushed out and tensions the chain. Now, as you can see, there's still a bit of slack in the chain, but to get rid of it, we're going to tighten this screw, which is going to push on the guide. And that's enough. When we see that there is no play in the chain, that means that it's tight enough. So now all we have to do is tighten the camshaft adjuster bolts. Perfect. So now that the camshaft adjusters have been tightened down, we can release the mechanical tensioner. Now onto the real chain tensioner, the hydraulic one. And courtesy of buying OEM parts, you can clearly see that the BMW logo is scraped off, and it's only the IVIS one that is still remaining, as is the case with most of the parts that I have bought as OEM replacements. And luckily, you can also see that the bolts cannot be separated from the tensioner. Thank God, because imagine dropping one of those in there. Nightmare. To set it up, we also need to push the guide a little bit, because as you can see, in its resting position, it sits too far back and the chain tensioner would not push on it. And now, the most satisfying part. Alright, now we can remove all of the locking tools from the camshafts and move on to the other side, where we'll do a speed run, because it's basically the same exact thing, just that it's on the other side. Man, this is starting to get heavy. Well, I guess that right about sums it up for setting the timing of the engine. Now let's check and see how well we did. First off, oil everything up. To check the timing of the engine, what I am going to do is remove the crankshaft locking pin, and I am going to do 2 full rotations of the crankshaft so that the camshafts also make a full turn, and this way we can also check that the timing is correctly set. And now slowly. And there it is. On the first bank, the camshaft locking tools line up perfectly. And so they do on the second one. Here is how the cam locking tool sits on the first bank. Completely flush. For exhaust. For intake rather. And here is for exhaust. Completely flush. And now for the second bank as well. The exhaust. Completely flush. And here is intake. Flush as well. And here you can see that the crankshaft is still locked. Now that the timing is set, we'll move on and we'll also place the front timing covers. First, clean up the surface. Brand new gaskets. They are the same exact gasket, just that it sits mirrored. The solenoid valves with brand new gaskets, as you can see. Also, here is a mesh filter that is of the utmost importance to be cleaned, because if this gets clogged or even dirty, it could cause rough engine running and all sorts of engine codes. The repair manual states that this should be lightly coated in oil when installing, so we're gonna do just that. It's now time for the valve covers, and since I've had them completely torn apart to be able to fully clean them, this is the oil separator, which we're going to install right now. It sits like so. The spaghetti gasket. Let's see how we can untangle all of this hotness. The kit that I bought also comes with one of these, which is a brand new gasket for the high pressure fuel pump, which is going to sit over here, just on the engine side. Now, hear me out. I hate, and I mean I hate, using silicone on flat surfaces such as these, but on some others, which are very weirdly shaped, such as these half moons, the one in the back and the two in the front, it's actually recommended to use a tiny bit of silicone, because the gasket would have to work extra hard to cover all of these areas which are so weirdly shaped. So as such, I'm just going to smear the tiniest bit of RTV right where the half moons start. This is not absolutely necessary, but the half moons are usually the places where the gasket is most likely to leak, just because it has that really weird shape and the gasket has to extend so much to cover all of it. Alright, that will do. And now with one swift motion, let's throw it on. This is where we are going to end the first part of the N63 rebuild, because from now on we once again have a complete long block, just that this time it is completely functional. And in the next video we are going to completely cover all of it under all of its accessories, like the cats, the turbos, the alternator, wiring harness, you name it. If you liked the video, or more importantly the type of content that I am putting out, you could show me by liking the video or even subscribing, as it is something that doesn't cost anything and it would only help the channel grow more, and it would help me put out this type of content more frequently for you. Also, do join me on the next part where we are going to complete rebuilding this engine, dropping all of the accessories on it and even putting it back into the car. Until then, stay tuned and ciao!